Andrew Neil is, in my judgment, the world's most distinguished and experienced print and broadcast journalist. For many years, he worked for Rupert Murdoch's News Corp. He was the editor of the UK Sunday Times in the 80s and the 90s before becoming the executive chairman of Sky News. And for the best part of a quarter of a century, he was at the BBC, most notably as the lead political interviewer at the Beeb. And if anyone is interested in seeing a good quality political journalist subjecting guests, whether they're Tory or Labor, Greens or Brexiteers, to really rigorous intellectual and political scrutiny, just go on YouTube and see Andrew Neil. He is the best in the business. And if I may say so, as someone who does also work at the ABC, there is no one like Andrew Neil at our ABC. Andrew is also a very prominent columnist at the Daily Mail. He writes a column every Saturday. It's about 2,000 words. It's always must reading. I read it every Saturday before I read the Sydney Morning Herald, among other papers. And Andrew is also chairman of Press Holdings, which publishes the UK Spectator, the oldest English language in the world, English-speaking language in the world, and also the Australian Spectator, which has been around since 2008. I had the great privilege of editing the Spectator Australia from 2009 to 2014. Rowan Dean, who's here tonight, edits it today, has been editing it since 2014, and copies are available. So with all that, please welcome the great man, Andrew Neil.
Thank you, Tom.
Andrew, welcome back to CIS and Australia.
Thank you. It's great to be back, and thank you for that introduction. My father would have believed it, and my mother would have liked it, so I'm grateful for that, and all I can say is the check's in the post. But since it's the Australian Post, I wouldn't hold you back.
Now, last time you were here in 2018, it was September 2018, so it was just after we knocked off a Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. And a few months later, you're at the BBC and you interviewed Malcolm Turnbull, and he said the reason why his Liberal Party colleagues knocked him off was because they feared he'd win the next election. Tell us more.
He did say that. It was in a restaurant in the heart of Westminster where we pre-recorded the interview. I thought I'd misheard him because no politician's ever said that to me before. And I said, you're saying that the reason they got rid of you is because they thought you'd win. And he said, yes, they thought I'd win. That's why we got rid. And actually, for once, I was a bit stumped for words. Anyway, it went viral in Australia. And
extraordinary.
It was an extraordinary answer.
And intriguingly, or perhaps not so, he's often the ABC's go-to guy when it comes to federal politics. You know, whenever there's a problem with the Liberal Party, the ABC go to him to talk about the problems in the federal Liberal Party. Was it a bit like this with Ted Heath with the Tories?
No, not really, because whatever you think of Malcolm's politics, I mean, he's a kind of avuncular. He's quite a easygoing character on television. Ted Heath was always miserable.
Right.
I mean, his nickname was just the Great Sulk. I mean, he sulked for like 30 years after Thatcher had deposed him. So although to begin with we went because, you know, he's a former Conservative Prime Minister, former Conservative leader, replaced by Margaret Thatcher, what he says was a story. After a while, it was so miserable interviewing him that, you know, we thought just leave him alone, let him sulk with his piano.
Now, when you were last here, we were talking about the political churn of our Prime Ministers in a short period of time. So you had Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, Rudd again, Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull, Scott Morrison. And this was a talking point around the world, but look at your own country since 2016.
Have I got to? Is that compulsory?
You've had 5 Tory Prime Ministers since 2016. David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak. I think I've got that right.
Yep.
How do you account for this dramatic churn in Westminster?
It's not just a British phenomenon. I think parties of the right everywhere are going through some quite serious turmoil and leadership. It's become a particular British problem because of Brexit. which was a disruptive event. The politicians lost control of the political process. That's what happens when you give people a referendum. Australia, take note. Mr. Albanese and Mr. Dutton, I mean, their careers, either one could find their career on the line as a result of the referendum. David Cameron knew if he lost the Scottish referendum, he'd have to resign. He won the Scottish referendum. He won it quite comfortably.
2015.
And ever since 2014. And ever since then, the Scottish Nationalists have done their best to destroy the case for Scottish independence, for which I thank them. And I have to report to you tonight, the union has never been stronger in modern times. For those of us who believe in the union, that is very good news. But Brexit in particular had this huge effect. It meant, unlike the Scottish referendum, David Cameron lost the Brexit referendum, and he had to resign. I think he did the honourable thing in resigning. But it had split the governing party, split it in several ways, made it in some ways dysfunctional, which referenda can do, particularly when this was the first referendum in which the people voted against the establishment. In previous, the establishment wanted the union to remain. The people voted that way. The establishment wanted to stay in the European Union when we voted to remain or stay in 1975. The establishment won that. The establishment wanted us to vote to remain in 2016. We voted to leave, 52 to 48. And that itself was hugely disruptive in British politics. Then, of course, you had the pandemic. And the pandemic played to a force that was already underway, which is that pandemics create an appetite for big government. They're like wars. Pandemics create the condition in which government begins to intrude and do things and spend money to a degree and in areas that they would never dream of doing in non-pandemic times. And that created and Boris Johnson, of course, was a natural big government conservative too. So he was happy to go along with this. That created a lot of disruption, and that created the Truss insurgency, which was about as successful as Bonnie Prince Charles's insurgency, or as I call it, the cluster truss. It's being a family event, I choose my words carefully. And although you could understand the motive for that, it was almost like a kind of Thatcherite rebellion against this move to big government. She was useless. And she hadn't prepared the ground. She didn't know what she was talking about. She was completely out of her depth. She lasted for 6 weeks.
Chancellor to blame as well, to be fair.
Yes.
Wasn't just her.
Oh, yes. And he should have known better. And then on top of it, I said to you, pandemics are a bit like war in terms of creating big government. I mean, the obvious example of that is the Attlee government in Britain in 1945, in which big government had beat the Nazis. So it was an easy argument, say big government will beat poverty. Big government will create a welfare state. And the British people voted overwhelmingly in 45 for that. It was like a war. Well, lo and behold, not only have we had the pandemic, we now have a war. We've got the biggest war in Europe since 1945, since the end of the Second World War. That again reinforced the big government too. And so you had all these tendencies going on, a chunk of the Conservative Party not liking it, another chunk being big government conservatives saying, no, this is fine. You had Brexit, which was disruptive. You had Ukraine, you had the pandemic. You had a level of incompetence as well. I mean, the Tory party gene pool is pretty depleted these days. I mean, the cabinet's got a combined IQ in single figures at the moment. So you add all that together and you've got the disruption. But you've seen the mess the Republican Party's in the United States. I don't need to tell you about the ructions the Liberal Party here has gone through. I mean, I look at the... let's take both the centre-right and the centre-left parties, the mainstream parties in France. The Republican Party, which is the old Gaullist party, the Socialist Party, which is a centre-left party, they barely don't exist anymore in France. You know, these are the people that ran the Fifth Republic since 1958 for 95% of the time. At the last election, the Republicans got 8% of the vote and the Socialists got 6% of the vote. So there are big forces at work here that haven't yet worked their way through. You look at Italy, where the right-wing party in charge now is not the traditional Berlusconi party, the traditional Conservative party. It's now run by Madame Meloni, who is from a much more right-wing populist tradition. Or you take the government party, the Law and Justice Party in Poland. Again, that's not a traditional Conservative party. That is a pretty hard right Conservative party there. So the parties of the left have had their problems, but I think the parties of the right have also had their problems, and that it's a long-winded way of saying there are both short-term and longer-term underlying trends. I just want to say, it would seem from where things stand at the moment that Mr. Sunak has settled the boat a bit.
Well, Labor's poll lead over the Tories, according to a poll this morning, has contracted to 14 points.
Correct.
That's the best it's been since Rishi Sunak's been there.
It has.
14 points is a lot, though.
14 is a lot. It isn't necessarily a lot in the midterm of a government.
Right.
What Mr. Sunak is, if you were betting, I think you would still have to bet that Labour will form the next government.
Okay. Keir Starmer being Prime Minister.
Yeah. Now, unlike Jeremy Corbyn, no one's frightened of Keir Starmer. Nobody's gagging for him either. He's not Tony Blair.
He's not Tony Blair.
Which was a watershed moment in British politics, won by the biggest landslide in 150, 160 years. But they're not frightened by him. The Tories have a certain past their sell-by feel about them. They're, as I say, running out of talent, running out of policies in a way too. Starmer has not, as they would say in Scotland, set the heather on fire. I mean, he hasn't even set his own window box on fire, never mind the heather. And so he's not rocking it.
And can Keir Starmer define a woman?
You have to ask Mr. Starmer that. What he does in his private life is none of my business. What I would say of Mr. Sunak is that he's building up I know the Prime Minister a little bit, don't know him well, but my political editor, James Forsyth, was his best friend and
now works for him.
Best man at his wedding, as Mr. Sunak was best man at James's wedding. And he's building up a reputation for competence, which the Tory party under Boris Johnson and then Liz Truss seriously lost. And then, if the Tories haven't got competence, what else do they
but hang on, mate. If the British economy is flatlining, the economic growth is pretty sluggish, why is a Tory Prime Minister proposing to increase company taxes?
You would have to ask him about that. I've interviewed him many times, and I've said to him, for 10 years, Tory chancellors told me that if they cut business tax, revenue would rise. Now you're telling me if we raise business tax, revenue will rise. Both statements cannot be right.
Can't be right, no.
One has to be wrong. And I think part of the problem has been that although Britain had the lowest corporation tax of any major economy, they managed to get it down to 19%. I think from about 28, they eventually got it down to 19. It did not produce a boom in investment. No. But that wasn't because of the level of taxation. If you look at private investment in Britain, from about after the great crash in 2008, it begins to recover a bit in 2009, and then it slowly, not dramatically, but slowly begins to rise. Then the Brexit referendum takes place, and it just flatlines. I think Brexit, because business, which was against Brexit, but also saw it as a step into the unknown, they just stopped investing.
Andrew, as you know, CIS is a classical liberal think tank, so we believe in free markets, productivity, enhancing economic reform, limited government.
Sure.
These are dark days for classical liberals and free marketeers. You just mentioned all these centre-right parties embracing big government. It reminds me of something, and I want to put this to you. Jonathan Friedland from The Guardian, at the height of the pandemic, around April, May of 2020, said that just as there are no atheists on a sinking ship, there are no free marketeers during a pandemic.
Well, I think that's true. Of course, it's perfectly possible to take the decision that during a pandemic, which is not, the free market's a wonderful thing. It is not the solution to everything. And it certainly isn't the solution to a pandemic. Margaret Thatcher would have created big government during a pandemic. But of course, once you've done that and you've won, you've conquered the pandemic, you go back to where you were. I think there are if I look round the mainstream right-wing parties at the moment, they are there's no Thatcherite, Reaganite party that of any importance at the moment. I think Donald Trump turned the Republicans into a big government party. I've explained about Britain. The hard right, or the more the non-mainstream right, like Madame Le Pen in France or Madame Meloni in Italy, they are not free marketeers. They believe in big government because they've got a lot of working class voters and they want to pump up the welfare state. They are pro-protectionism. They're pro-very high minimum wage. So, and I think that's why mistrust fell in her face, because the time wasn't right for her revolution and she hadn't done the homework. If you are going to go for a more what I would call a Jeffersonian approach,
decentralization,
but smaller government, and therefore lower taxes. If you're going to go for that route and less regulation, and the government, which these days just tries to do too much, and so much of what it does very badly. If you had government to try and concentrate more on what it has to do, defense of the realm, condition of the people, and all the rest of it, and try to do that well. If you're going to argue for that, you need to prepare the ground. And in the run-up to the Thatcher Revolution, which kicked it off in 1979 when she won her first election, a lot of groundwork had been done by think tanks like this. The
IEA.
Institute of Economic Affairs. I was at The Economist throughout the 1970s. We did a lot of the groundwork. The Economist then, a very different magazine from now, and it's now the publishing arm of Davos Man and Davos Woman.
She's the editor, right?
Indeed, we call the editor Zeni. Davos Woman is her name.
Yes.
Which works on so many levels as a nickname. In these days, it was more of a center-right. We used to say we wrote from the radical center. The center was not a place where you just split your differences. You could have radical policies. So the novel idea that you could privatize, as the Americans would call it, garbage collection. The novel idea that perhaps an airline did not have to be state-owned.
Yes.
That you could do it, that British Telecom didn't have to be state-owned, that you could survive on less government. And the trickiest of all to get across, that there are sub-tax rates, not all, not the basic rate of income tax, but the higher marginal rates. If you cut them judiciously, you will end up with more revenue. That's a counterintuitive argument to get across. So I'm going to cut the rate of tax, but I'll get more revenue. And of course, when Nigel Lawson sadly departed from us.
And by the way, there's a brilliant piece by the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, a tribute to Nigel Lawson in the current issue of The Spectator, which you have a copy of.
Yeah, when Mr. Lawson did that in the 1980s, not only did we get more revenue from the top income, a bigger share of income tax revenues came from the better off.
Yes.
It's because they were paying their income tax now. They were coming back from low tax zones. But it takes a lot of homework to do that. Yes. You can't just spring it on the public. And I guess if you want to be really miserable, not only, and it always suits a Scottish Presbyterian to be miserable, we live in constant fear that somewhere in the world somebody might actually be enjoying themselves. Not only is nobody promulgating these ideas at the moment, no one's laying the groundwork for them either.
Nigel once told me he learned a valuable lesson from Enoch Powell, of all people. And he had this line that I've often paraphrased, which is that, and I say this to a lot of younger people, a lot of younger Australians, and indeed younger Brits, millennials, the Generation Z, they're attracted to socialism. They're very contemptuous of free market capitalism.
If you haven't lived through it, it probably sounds quite nice.
Yeah. Well, they embrace socialism. And I say, and this is Nigel's point, and before him, Enoch Powell, that you don't tax a loss, you tax a profit. Because only profit, only capitalism will provide governments with the revenue you need to pay for health and education and welfare and defence and so on and so forth. Simple message.
But they're all basic arguments that we've kind of forgotten and that almost nobody is making now. I mean, as you say, even Rishi Sunak has been the one pushing up corporate taxes. He said he needs the revenue. We'll see if he gets any of the revenue. Taxes are always cutting taxes is something they'll do tomorrow, never today. And, you know, Nigel Lawson also said you can't cut taxes on the back of debt. You can't borrow.
Yeah.
He didn't cut taxes by borrowing.
No,
He
and
cut
that's what trust
taxes
did.
by getting
Yeah.
control of spending. And
Well-
I think the Western world has reached quite a dangerous phase at the moment, in that throughout the Western world, we have built massive welfare states on debt.
Yes.
They're all built on debt. They're not. I mean, the only honest people here are the Scandinavians. They have the most advanced welfare states, but you have the highest taxes.
Yes, but they have low company tax rates.
They had to do that because they all moved to London. They had no choice.
But this is a very good point you raised, because I want to just segue here to an article that my colleague Robert Carling wrote today in the Financial Review. And this is about Victoria, which is, as John Howard says, the Massachusetts of Australia. And
I think that's unfair in Massachusetts.
this is Robert Carling. The headline: Victoria's crippled finances are all Daniel Andrews' fault, the Premier. Having resisted any appeals from the federal government for moderation in 2020 and 2021, it's a bit rich for the Victorian Premier to look to Canberra now for help in fixing his budget black hole. So Victoria's got a real debt problem here. There is a question I'm here is, there is a cost to high levels of big government.
There's a cost to high levels of big. I mean, the one thing you have to be clear on is that in some areas there's a case for big government. And there's the pandemic created we realized that being dependent on 10,000-mile long supply lines was not necessarily a sensible thing to do. The pandemic taught us that. But if you want to shorten supply lines, that basically means an industrial strategy, which means big government. So you have a choice there. One thing follows as night follows day is that big government means big taxes. You can only borrow so much, and it catches up with you. And most Western governments have maxed out the credit card. I mean, you take Greece's national debt is now 175% of its GDP. I'll say that again, 175% of its GDP. Even a big economy like France is 113% of its GDP. France is quite a good case study, poster child for the current situation at the moment, because France has this massive national debt. It's the second biggest economy in the EU, 130. That means that next year, if France devoted all of its GDP to paying off its national debt, all of its GDP, it still would not have paid off its national debt. It's also the most taxed country in Europe. It's quite hard to see taxes going higher. The previous government raised taxes on the better off, as governments tend to do, because it's less controversial. The result was that France lost 60,000 millionaires. 60,000. Didn't realize there were 60,000 millionaires in France, but there were. Most of them no longer there now.
No.
That's a huge chunk of its tax base, because one of the features of the modern world is that the tax base now becomes more and more dependent on a small number of people. The top 1% of income earners in Britain now account for 30% of income tax revenues.
Wow.
1%.
Wow.
You lose that, you've lost your tax base. Income
yeah.
tax is still the single biggest generator. So it's quite hard to put up taxes any further. You put them up and the rich leave. There's nobody more mobile than a well-educated professional person. Government spending in France is now 59% of GDP. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah.
Your federal government here spends barely half of that
that's right.
as a share of
25.
GDP.
Yeah.
59%. I don't think they need any encouragement. They just build another
what was Margaret Thatcher's-
snowy 2.0. And you'll,
What was Margaret Thatcher's line about socialism?
oh, they run out of other people's money, but you're not running out of other people's money. So where do you go? I mean, you can't really borrow anymore, particularly at a time of rising interest rates. So you take the Victoria, they are now going to be spending $7 billion a year on debt finance. They probably don't spend that much on schools. That's a huge cost to the state treasury. So that's hard to increase taxes. It's hard to spend more. You reach the limit on borrowing. There has to be a reckoning there, and I think that's one of the things that will work out in the 2020s.
You say there should be a reckoning, and there will be, no doubt. But the concern we have at CIS is that a lot of younger generations think that this is an excuse for more government intervention.
Yes, though in my experience, the younger people's views on politics I mean, what they know about economics, you could write on the back of a postage stamp and still leave room for the Lord's Prayer. Because they don't give a monkey's about economics. Yeah. They've been brought up in relative affluence. It's not a huge issue. There isn't a post-war rebuilding going on. There isn't a need for growth. They're much more concerned about cultural identity issues.
Yes.
And cultural identity issues really do suck the lifeblood out of a political system, and they divide us where we should be united. They make us argue about things in the grand scheme of things. I mean, how this transgender business has managed to get on to national debate and become a national issue is beyond me. But that's what seems to get them out of bed in the morning. Actually, in many cases, they don't bother to get out of bed. So I think that what has happened in modern times, and of course, this is basically the move of the culture of the campus into the boardrooms and the newsrooms and the business offices of the rest of society and the government agencies and so on, which means, I'm afraid, it has a long way to go.
Well, radical cultural sea change. That brings me to something that Oxfam recently did. It apologised for the English language, Andrew, describing it as, quote, the language of a colonising nation. They also counselled against using the words mother and father, this is Oxfam, because they ascribe gendered roles. What's going on here?
Well, I mean, as you know, I wrote a column. The reason you know that is you read my column. So that's
I did my homework.
You passed the test and you did your homework. This is not unusual now. This is happening all the time. So one of the reasons that the Spectator in Australia is going to start a new weekly, or actually bi-weekly or twice weekly newsletter called Cafe Culture. And it's going to be about these issues because they have to be taken on and they need to be beaten before we can get back to the things that matter. And people, I mean, the woman, the Indigenous academic that I was on with at Q&A on Monday night, I'm sure you'll watch it because it's got such a huge audience these days. The woman I was on said that her cultural identity is the most important thing to her. I strongly, or even her racial identity, I think she was also leader. I strongly disagree with that. I really, in fact, I know this will surprise. I'd like to see a bit of an old-fashioned dose of Marxism come back, because Marx taught us about social class.
Yes.
And social class can divide us, but it can also unite us.
Yes.
In a way that this cultural identity stuff does not. It specifically looks for division and then aggravates them and exploits them. They are never happier unless they're finding out what differentiates us. That means that economics is relegated to irrelevance, and it means, I mean, for example, you've got The Voice coming up. I will speak naturally, having been here for at least 6 days now as a walking expert on The Voice. Like all journalists, you know, we think we know what we do. I mean, when I got on the plane from London to come here, The Voice was a TV show. When I landed in Sydney, it was a constitutional amendment. But you are going to have this debate now, and it's not for me to take sides. Spectator Australia will take the side. The editor will determine that. But you're going to have this debate, which is basically about a particular cultural identity, elevating that above everything else, which is going to rip you apart and is going to suck the bandwidth out of the rest of the political system at a time when the global economy is still in a relatively precarious position. And I would venture to suggest, from my position of total ignorance, will in the end do nothing for the Indigenous community of this country, who need things to be done. But it will be brilliant for the political elite. It will create jobs and bureaucracy and power and importance. I'll just give you a quick example of that. The referendum in Scotland for independence in 2014, which the SNP led, was in a sense the argument that the Scots should have their own voice, that it should be a separate nation with a distinctive Scottish voice. Now, those of us who were against that argued that Scotland already had its own voice. You know, it has a powerful voice within the Union. And I mean, and if the Scots disappear to run their own affairs, I mean, who the hell's going to run England? I mean, you know, we've been doing it for the English for 300 years. They're just not used to running their own affairs anymore. So that was an argument for a voice in a different way from what's happening here, but it was for a voice. And let's create a political system that will give them the voice. So this is what happened. It did create, we didn't get independence, but it did create a home rule parliament in which all domestic matters are now run out of Edinburgh. Basically, foreign policy, defence and macroeconomic issues are still run out of what the SNP laughingly called the Imperial Parliament in London. But here was the consequence of that. Scotland got its voice of home rule in Edinburgh. A parliament that they said would cost 80 million Australian dollars to build ended up costing 900 million, just shy of $1 billion to build a home rule parliament. 130 people became members of that parliament, earning salaries they could not dream of earning anywhere else. And none of them had earned anything like it before. They had power. They had position. They were the bee's knees. The media there loved it because the media had its own wee parliament to cover and all gave them jobs and so on. So the political elite did fine. So did all the quangos, all the government bodies around that the Scottish government bought them up. You take a rape crisis, which is Scotland, which is meant to represent the victims of rape. That is now 70% funded by the Scottish government, and so never takes a critical line against the Scottish government, even in the transgender issue, when Nicola Sturgeon was trying to put a twice convicted rapist who had suddenly self-identified as a woman into a women's prison. I mean, how stupid can you be? Well, stupid enough for her to lose her job.
Yes.
So all that worked for the political elite. But what about the ordinary people of Scotland who were promised better policies? The attainment gap between poor kids and better off affluent kids in Scottish schools got wider. It's never been wider than now. Waiting lists for the NHS are longer even than England, and they're long in England. They've never been longer in Scotland. Cancer outcomes are amongst the worst in Europe. And deaths from drug addiction are the worst in Europe, not just Britain, by a factor of 5, by a ratio of 5. So political elite sitting in Edinburgh, we're fine. We've got our offices, we've got the power, we've got all the rest. The ordinary people of Scotland, what benefit have they seen? And that may be an issue of where cultural identity and things like the voice, that may be where it leads.
Andrew, I know that Rowan Dean asked you this question on Sky News at the weekend, but I'll ask it for this audience. I mean, you've interviewed many prominent political figures over a long period of time. If you had a moment with the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, and you could ask him a question, what would it be about the voice?
I would ask him that how can the people of Australia make an informed decision on the voice if they don't know the answers to the most important questions? Because I find it, as I say, as an outsider looking in, this is a very important decision. It may be right, may be wrong to vote for the voice. That's a matter for you, not for me. But if I had a vote, I would like to know who will choose the voice? How will it be chosen? For how long would you serve in the voice? Will you be paid to be in the voice? What will the overall budget for the voice be? How big will the bureaucracy be? Is it purely advisory? Or would it, with judicial activism, actually gain more power? After all, Mr. Albanese has said it would be a brave government that would limit the voice or ignore the voice. Is it confined, because the wording I think is opaque, is it confined to matters of direct relevance to the Indigenous community? Or would the voice have a say over the AUKUS Treaty, Would it have a say over the Reserve Bank of Australia's interest rate policy? And to all these questions, it seems to me so far, answers have there been none. Now, it's early days, they may come out in the campaign. But before I could make up my mind on, as I understand it, there's a consensus in Australia for reconciliation and for recognition of the particular
I think there's a widespread
position.
view that supports Indigenous constitutional recognition.
Correct, right.
The question is whether this voice model is the
We do
appropriate
it.
measure.
And I think it's quite hard to come to a decision on that until some of these questions are answered.
Now, the Prime Minister is among those who says that Australia's standing in the world is at stake here, and he argues that a rejection of the Yes campaign in the October referendum will damage Australia's international relations. You followed Australia from afar for a long period of time. Is there any truth to that argument that Australia's standing will be diminished significantly in the world?
I would, to use a technical, infelicitous technical term, say it's a lot of bollocks. I mean, first of all, no one outside Australia knows anything about The Voice. No one's been following this. It's had no international
I think the New York Times had
coverage.
a short story a few months ago.
Yeah, well, there you go. I mean, this weekend Sunday Times of London, its story was that an Indigenous figure was going to replace King Charles on one of the Australian currency bills.
Yeah.
It wasn't about the voice. No. I think the view, insofar as people know anything about Australia from abroad, and they know very little. It's a country, it's a long way away. It's a hell of a big country, but it's 25 million people, which is basically the population of the M25, inside the M25 in London. It's a country that is growing in importance. I think the AUKUS deal has made that clear, and I'm very pleased that Britain is now going to be a seminal part of that, as well as Australia and the United States. I would say, insofar what people do know about Australia, they like Australia. They like Australia. They like the attitude of Australians. They like the lifestyle. They like the prosperity that Australia seems to have. They like the no-nonsense kind of egalitarian attitude of Australians. I don't think The Voice has anything to do with Australia's reputation, except that you might now, of course, created an own goal, having decided you're going to have this referendum. And I see a lot on the Yes side saying if you are against it, you're a bunch of racists. That could then become the view that if you do vote against it, the rest of the world say, I didn't know that, but Australians are a bunch of racists. But that's an own goal. You brought that on yourselves.
Yes. Andrew, let's change the subject and talk about American politics. You follow the United States very closely, you have for many years. The Trump indictment last week, what do you think of the likely consequences of the Trump indictment for the American presidential political scene, given that Trump is gaining a new lease on life?
Well, he has gained a new lease of life. I mean, I think it's very bad news, what's happened. And I think that if you were going to break the precedence of 250 years and charge a former president with criminal charges, which has never happened before, even though a few previous presidents have been criminals, they were never charged by it. I just can't help feeling you would need something a lot more substantial than putting in wrong entry bookkeeping.
Yes.
Which is, we all know what Donald Trump did.
Yes. He paid hush money to a porn
he
star.
paid as the chap who does Donald Trump on Saturday Night Live, which I found a very unfunny show on NBC.
Yes.
But it was funny on Saturday night. They had this guy impersonating Donald Trump because it was Easter, saying he was really the modern Jew, Jesus, and that like Jesus, all he had done was to try and help a sex worker.
Very Madeline.
which actually even got me to chuckle.
Very Madeline. Yeah. That's pretty funny.
So I think they've made a big mistake.
Yes.
In going for him on this. My own view is that the most serious potential charge against Donald Trump is his attempt to lean on the Georgia authorities, Republicans, to find an extra 13,000 votes.
This was after the 2020 election.
After the 20, that seems to me to be a lot more serious. It also means
there's actual telephone evidence.
it's recorded. You can hear it to him. It also means that because misentering falsifying bookkeeping, first of all, is subject to a statute of limitations, which has already run out, and counts as a misdemeanor, not a felony under American or New York state law. What this district attorney has to do now is argue that the misdemeanor were used in pursuit of a bigger felony, which is criminal. That strikes the statute of limitations and turns a misdemeanor into a proper criminal charge. The problem is he can't tell us what that felony is. He's trying to make out it's the breach of campaign law, of finance law.
Yeah.
That's federal law. He's a state judge. And I don't see what the breach was. It was Donald Trump's own money. He didn't use campaign finances. And then he said, oh, well, there was also tax. The New York state was cheated out of tax. That isn't actually true. What Trump did to pay back his sleazebag lawyer, Mr. Cohen, was to double the money that had been given to the porn star so that Cohen could then afford his income taxes on the money he got. So the New York state got the income tax. Actually, it got income tax on money it wasn't going to get. So I don't know how you do that. And what it's done, though, just the political fallout, is it has energized the Trump base. It has meant funds pouring in, $15 million in the 3 days after he appeared in the Manhattan court. It has knocked back Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who's the only serious contender for the Republican nomination. He now looks like a diminished man and is running all over the place wondering what to do. He even said that if New York State tried to extradite Mr. Trump from Florida, he would stand in their way. I mean, a ludicrous proposition, but that's how worried
And we should say DeSantis won in Florida. He was re-elected by 19 points.
19 points.
So his political capital went up after those November elections, whereas Trump's went down because most of his candidates did very badly at the midterm elections.
So it's early days and a lot can happen, but it has undoubtedly improved enormously Mr. Trump's chances of winning again the Republican nomination. It has also made it certain that Mr. Biden will run again as well on the grounds that I may be 82, but I beat him last time.
Yes.
And I can do so again. And I think the prospect there is not a happy one for a country that we all depend on in various ways and, you know, need as part of a guarantor of our freedoms. Both Australia and the United Kingdom need good and close relations with America. You've got a choice between a narcissist in his late 70s, facing a number of criminal charges, who we know will be like a bull in a china store when it comes to foreign policy, at a time when the war in Ukraine continues and the Chinese get ever more militant in their training exercises off the coast of Taiwan, and an 82-year-old
Geriatric.
with a vice president who is not fit for purpose. But
Kamala Harris.
But he cannot get rid of her because she is ethnic and female. If he had a vice president who was a useless old white man, he could get rid of her. They're easily dispensable and disposable. But Kamala Harris, he cannot get rid of. That is a terrible choice.
So you're suggesting that
the
at this
American
stage,
people.
all things considered, 2024 is likely to be a repeat of 2020.
As
Biden, Trump.
things stand at the moment.
Okay, well, let me put this to you. This is George Will, the legendary Washington Post
Indeed.
columnist, who's been writing a column twice a week for the Post since the early 70s. He was a guest at CIS during the pandemic. We did a Zoom event, about 500,000 views with George right at the height of those riots after the death of George Floyd. This is what George Will wrote in the Washington Post just after the Trump indictment. Maybe, just maybe, this is rock bottom for embarrassing US politics.
Yeah, I think it is rock bottom, which is why I agree with that, which is why I'm a little bit depressed at the choice that could emerge from it. But quite often you can stay at rock bottom for quite a while.
Yes.
You know, it doesn't necessarily follow that when you hit rock bottom, you start to bounce back up again. And the danger is that the die is now cast, that Look, America, we all live in a world where things change quickly overnight. So it's, you know, I remember, what was it that there was a famous football manager who says, I don't make predictions and I never will. Oh, hold on, I think you just made a prediction. So we have to be careful. And I think we can only stick with the knowledge we have at the moment. But sitting here tonight, I think Mr. Trump must now be regarded as favorite to get the Republican nomination. I wouldn't have said that if we were here only a couple of months ago.
That's if he keeps out of jail.
Well, he can run from jail. There was a candidate in 1920 ran for president from jail.
Right.
Called Eugene Debs.
Oh, the socialist.
He ran from jail. Woodrow Wilson had jailed him because he had fought against the draft for the First World War. He was accused of treason. He ran from, I think it was a Pennsylvania penitentiary somewhere, and he got 1 million votes. And he didn't do any kind. In fact, he got more votes than he got the previous time he ran for president. So don't tell Donald Trump that. No, look, if he's in jail, I think that's a
okay.
But I'm just saying. But Biden is then the charge. No Democrat is going to challenge Biden if Biden says he's going to run.
Yes.
If Biden says he's not running, there will be a bloodbath in the Democrat Party because Kamala Harris will not be a shoo-in. Indeed, I don't think she would win the nomination. It would be entirely new. But as things stand at the moment, that looks like a repeat. And it's not a happy prospect, given that we live in a world where the dictators are on the march and democracy's on the defensive.
You say these are unpredictable times, but they're also dangerous times. You just made that point. Times. I mean, the Ukraine crisis remains unresolved after a year. Indeed. You mentioned earlier that China, in just the last few days, they had these military drills along the vibrant island democracy of Taiwan. There's still tensions in the Persian Gulf. And at the same time, you've got a very divided, polarized America that's likely to put forward at the next election these two political lightweights. How can we in Australia, and indeed Britain, and indeed general allies of the United States, have faith in US staying power in the world, given all of these deep divisions in the United States?
Well, I always take comfort in Churchill's words when he said of America, you can always be sure in the end America will do the right thing. It just takes a while to get there. And that's usually what happens. And I think that, I think if Mr. Trump was to become president again, all bets are off. Who knows what he would do? What would have happened if Mr. Trump had been in the White House when Ukraine was invaded? I would suggest that Putin would be in Kyiv by now. He would not have stopped it. He would have found some reason not to.
Well, the counter-argument is that Trump would have made it very clear that Ukraine would never be part of NATO, and that's why he wouldn't invade.
But if you think that the reason why Mr. Putin invaded Ukraine was because he was worried to be part of NATO, I've got a bridge to sell you. It's called the Brooklyn Bridge. It's mine. He invaded Ukraine because he thinks it's part of Greater Russia. That's why he invaded it. His strategic and geostrategic role is to recreate the near abroad, not to recreate the old Soviet Empire, not take back the stands or anything like that. But the Baltic states, Ukraine, he's already taken the Crimea, Georgia, all of that up to the Polish border. That's his aim. Donald Trump would have said nothing to stop that. Indeed, Putin would have taken comfort. He didn't think we were going to react anyway. He thought we were too weak and divided. He got the shock of his life when actually the West got together and NATO, which President Macron had said was brain dead, turned out to be pretty formidable.
And what are the consequences here for China re Taiwan?
I think the consequences on one element, it's a plus for China because it's forcing attention away from the Indo-Pacific region to an area of the world which we thought was over in terms of major geopolitical change. We thought that any problems in Europe were essentially regional problems, not global problems. And yet America has been and America was making its famous pivot to the Pacific. America has taken the view from Hillary Clinton to George Bush and so on, that the 21st century is the Pacific century.
President Obama was in the Australian Parliament in 2011
as well. But suddenly America's been forced back to America now has 100,000 troops in Europe. It's getting back to Cold War levels again. It has 12,000 troops in Poland. That's not a tripwire. That's a defensive force. You can't lose 12,000 troops and not force in. They have now built this massive base. Yes. Now the biggest base in Europe is in Poland, and they've never had a base in Poland before, and they love the Poles because unlike the Germans or the French, the Poles are prepared to spend money on their own defense.
But Andrew, can America walk and chew gum at the same time?
Hold on. You're worse than me. Let me so all that is good news for China because it takes our focus away from what is clearly going to be a much bigger problem in Ukraine in the 21st century. I think the good news on Ukraine is that it's made President Xi realize that invading a country that's prepared to fight for its freedom is not as easy as you might think. And Taiwan is better equipped than Ukraine, with a better, more modern military, and is part of an informal defensive alliance that America would. I mean, I was out at Fort Meade at the NSA, the National Security Agency. They have a lot of plans. I don't think China would know what's going to hit it. And Xi knows that he cannot fail on this. Because if he fails the Faustian, first of all, it would, even if he wins, it destroys the Chinese economy. There is no way that the Taiwanese are going to let China have TMSC. And that is the most sophisticated, it makes 90% of the world's most sophisticated chips. They'll blow it up rather than let China have it. And they have moved a huge chunk of the production to Alabama.
Yes.
So he's got to think carefully that if he fails, and you remember the Faustian pact with the Chinese Communist Party and the China people is you will have no freedom, but we're going to look after you. If the global economy and hence the Chinese economy is destroyed, that Faustian pact breaks.
Back to the first point that you made about China and the upside for China, I mean, and the downside for America being distracted by the Ukraine crisis. I mean, you know, it's been more than 30 years since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of Soviet communism. And that was the time of the unipolar moment, as Charles Krauthammer called it. This was the notion of American global leadership and a Pax Americana, if you like. But surely the lessons of the Iraq debacle and the debacle in Afghanistan is that there are real limits on America's power.
Yes.
Can it walk and chew gum? Be Asia and Europe at the same time?
Let me come back to that question, which you rudely interrupted my previous answer on that, because it's a very good question. And the answer is no. In the long term, and by that I mean through the 20s into the 2030s and beyond, even America cannot afford to defend Europe and pivot to the Pacific. For a start, the kind of military required in the Pacific is totally different from the kind of military in Europe. So essentially Europe is boots on the ground, as that build-up in Poland shows. Overwhelmingly in the Pacific, you need amphibious forces. And that's an entirely different kind of military there. So America cannot do both. There is not the political will to do both. So, and I think the second thing is it could be Mr. Biden, for all his faults, he's actually done, I think, very well on Ukraine. He could be the last Atlanticist president that we get. The last one that regards Europe, because that's his generation, as the front line for America. The front line will easily move, I think, to the Eastern Pacific, which of course is of more importance to Australia. So something will have to give. And that is, what it means is that at some stage, Europe will have to do more of its own defense. I mean, Europe is the biggest welfare state spending in the world and some of the smallest military spending. And that is why the balance of power in Europe is now moving eastwards. And the rising power in Europe now is Poland. And that's the country the Americans love. It's the country that Britain has very good relationships with, going way back to the Battle of Britain, which I doubt we would have won if it hadn't been for the contribution of the Polish pilots. Poland is now, if you look at what is happening, Poland got Ukraine right. They said they're going to invade. Berlin and Paris said, no, they're not. We can talk them out of it anyway. Macron goes and sees him, sits at one end of a table that's about 3 miles long to President Putin. The Germans say no. Poland said to Germany, don't take this gas. They're going to sucker you in. They'll make you dependent. You lose any control of foreign policy. They said, don't you worry, we know what we're doing. And as Germany was agreeing to build Nord Stream 2, the second gas pipeline from Russia, Poland was building floating LNG stations off the coast so that it could take in gas from Qatar and from the United States. Poland called every one of these things right. It is now building an army which will be the biggest in Europe. Its army at the moment is 115,000 strong. In 5 years' time, it will be 250,000 strong. 300,000 strong. 250 full-time professional soldiers, 50,000 highly trained reservists. It is buying 35 Abrams tanks from America, but that's just in a way as a symbolic gesture for the Americans, because the Abrams tanks work by turbine and they're a nightmare unless you have all the backup. Far more important and almost totally unreported, they're buying 1,000 tanks from South Korea. 1,000 tanks from South Korea. They are now, if you look at, and by the way, there is total consensus in Poland on doing this. No one's arguing against it. They are not going to be invaded again. Now, you add in the Baltic states, who are ready to fight as well, an army. Britain has 5,000 troops in the Baltic states now. We patrol their perimeter defense with our Typhoon fighters and our troops. Even at the height of the Cold War, something is now happening that never happened. Finland and Sweden are joining NATO.
Yeah.
The strategic significance of that is huge. That part of Europe was always our weakest link, because Finland and Poland were not in NATO. I was speaking to Carl Bildt recently, former Swedish Prime Minister. If you take Denmark, Finland, Sweden and Norway and Denmark, of course, already being members, but you take these 4 Scandinavian countries, they alone can now mobilize 250 state-of-the-art fighter jets over the Baltic. There's no way Russia can move against that. Yeah. I mean, Russian military is so depleted, it has a better chance of invading Mars than it has of invading the Baltic states. These are a huge change, and it's moving Europe east.
Okay, and that perhaps explains why, to mark the 1-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, President Biden went to Poland.
There. Yeah. And, the degree of cooperation, the Poles have taken in 1.5 million Ukrainian refugees. They actually took in 6 million, and then some of the 6 million moved around. Some went back. When Kyiv didn't fall, some were able to go back to the West. But they took in 1.5 million. They've done this massive defense build-up. All the arms that are going to the Ukrainian forces go through Poland. That's the only way. And the Americans had a major problem. They have this logistical operation now that a plane full of military equipment can leave the eastern seaboard of the United States at 6 o'clock in the evening, local time, and be deployed by the Ukrainian army at 3 o'clock in the afternoon the next day, local time. They land in Poland. The problem is, how do you get them from Poland into Ukraine? The Americans said, look, we can't put American soldiers, we can't send this stuff unprotected. It's state-of-the-art equipment. But we can't have American soldiers, and we think you probably can't have Polish soldiers either. You're a member of NATO. And the Poles said, no, we can't do that, but we know what we will do. And they said, the Americans said, well, what are we going to do? And they said, we are calling up all our retired special forces, and we are creating an unofficial unit of these guys. They are really well trained. They still get some training, but they're not part of the Polish army. They're not official Polish soldiers, and they take the weapons in. That's the kind of cooperation the Americans love. At a time when Macron is thinking he can talk Putin to the peace table, or Schultz is in. The situation in Germany is so absurd that the Greens are now more militant about the military than the Social Democrats.
Yes.
So that is why just to finish, the significance of this switch to the balance of power as it moves in. By the way, Romania has become, which is also a member of NATO, is a key Black Sea state now. That will allow, given that for Russia, that is the near abroad, that will allow the Americans over time to withdraw. And the British, despite Brexit, will play a major part in that because we have great relations with all of them. And an unknown thing that was basically, we did two things that have not really been reported. The Poles were very worried that they would be a subject of cyber warfare assaults by the Russians. And so the British have the best cyber warfare defenses in Europe. We extended our defenses to the eastern border, which included Poland. We protect Poland from cyber warfare. And in the interim period between Sweden and Finland saying they wanted to join NATO, which we knew would take a time because we knew Turkey would cause problems, the British government extended its nuclear umbrella over Finland and Sweden. Yeah. These are not widely reported, but I can assure you in Helsinki, the political elite noticed. And I think one of the reasons why Rishi Sunak was able to solve the Northern Ireland Protocol in the end was because Warsaw, the Baltic states, Helsinki, and Stockholm said to Brussels, look, we are dependent on the British, on nuclear umbrella, cyber warfare, troops in Estonia, and you're arguing about sausages going to Northern Ireland? Stop it already. Do a deal. And I think that had a huge influence in getting that deal done.
Notwithstanding all your interesting and sound points here about Europe.
Oh.
No, I'll put this to you.
This is when politicians say to you, with respect, you're talking complete nonsense. Surely a rising China is a much greater threat to world order than a declining Russia that's bogged down in the Donbass. But I mean, America is still going to be focused on Europe. It's still going to be part of NATO. How can it still walk and chew gum? Well, I've answered that. Okay, I mean, you want to go through it all again? It was quite a long answer. I've told you that in the short term...
Well, all the weapons that the Americans are giving to Ukraine, isn't that depleting America in a fighting force in East Asia?
Let me give you a class for slow learners. The weapons that are required in Europe are very different from the weapons required in the Pacific. And we're in an interim stage where Ukraine has given us a breathing space for Europe to get its act together. My argument is that getting its act together will happen more in the East than it will with the Germans and the French. But it will mean as we rebuild along the lines I've suggested, America will pivot. Because as I said quite clearly, America in the long term cannot afford to do
I get that,
both.
But we've had at this CIS, Peter Jennings, one of Australia's leading defence intellectuals, and he says the moment for China to strike is in the next few years when America is so focused on Europe and America is less focused on East Asia. And moreover, that China has huge demographic challenges and serious internal challenges which will hurt them in the next 10 to 20 years. But in the short term, they might be in a more agile position to strike.
Well, but they're not in a more agile position to strike because they haven't got the military could do it yet. You know, the state of the Chinese military is nowhere near ready to take on Taiwan. They have a lot more work they have to do. Even Xi, I mean, privately in the Politburo, they think they won't be ready before 2027. There's a scare tactics in Washington. I know the generals are talking about, it could happen in 2025. Yes. I think that's to get more military spending. That's what that's about. And also, as I said earlier, if Xi fails, he's finished. I mean, it could be like the Australian referendum. Whoever loses, whether it's Mr. Dutton or Mr. Albanese, it could end their political career. Xi knows that. He can't afford to lose. The Americans have not taken their eye off the ball in the Pacific. My argument is in the longer term, they can't afford to do both. But, you know, they are planning. One of the things they are planning to do, which will give the Chinese quite a shock, if the Chinese strategy is still the million-man swim, that's what they call it, which is it'll be an amphibious force, 1 million strong, to go to Taiwan. It'll be the biggest amphibious attempted landing since D-Day. They have a problem with that. First of all, there is no Normandy beach in Taiwan. There are very few places where you can land, and they're incredibly well defended. They think that they can neutralize the American Navy, the 7th Fleet, they can make that ineffective on what we used to call the Straits of Formosa, now the Straits of Taiwan. That's not what the Americans are going to do. They're going to stand off on that. They are ready, and you can't build up 1 million strong amphibious force without us knowing about it. Yeah. You know, we knew Putin was going to invade Ukraine. We'll certainly see 1 million people building up. The Americans have developed 1,000 sea mines controlled by artificial intelligence, which they are going to seed the whole Straits of Taiwan in the event that China looks like it's going to attack. And these mines go to the bottom of the ocean and they just lie there. But because they're controlled by, and the Americans do nothing, but because they're controlled by artificial intelligence, they will read if there's a major amphibious force coming across the straits, and they will rise and they will destroy the Chinese force. I mean, the Chinese are in for quite a shock if they attempt this. The degree of the American technology on this is quite huge, and they are teaching the Taiwanese on cyber warfare and all the rest of it, and they can position their navy, which has the ability to hit the amphibious force, but the amphibious force and the Chinese couldn't hit the American navy. So
now we've got time for questions, and our first question will go, Seg, just over here.
Thank you, Andrew Neil. I just want to ask you, one of your most famous interviews, and I've watched this multiple times, was with Alex Jones, and you once said that it was one of the worst interviews that you've ever conducted. Has there been any interview that has almost matched the title? And how did you feel about actually asking him so many questions?
Alex Jones, we should be clear, is a right-wing conspiracy theorist?
It's not the Alex Jones. There's an Alex Jones here. It's not. Is it Alex Jones?
That's Alan Jones.
Oh, that's Alan Jones.
No.
It's not. It's not. Alan.
No. Alex
it's when
Jones.
You said right-wing conspiracy theorist.
No. I think there's a difference.
Alex Jones was difficult to interview simply because he's an idiot, and nothing has given me more pleasure than to see him bankrupted by the parents in that mass shooting. Yeah. I mean, he said, I forget what the name was, because there's so many mass shootings in America now.
Yeah, the New York.
But he said this mass shooting had been staged by actors, and that it was just the gun control lobby had staged this. Now, he said this of parents who had lost 40 children, and you couldn't get them to retract it. So then they sued him, and they won over $1 billion. And he'll be panhandling on the streets soon, and I shall not be putting anything into his hat. So he was just an idiot, believer in global conspiracy. It wasn't a serious interview. So it was. I said on air, "You're the worst person I've ever had to interview," and I would stick by that. He was the first because he was subject to no logic or control. I was trying to say goodbye at the end of the program. He was still shouting at me. And it was all an act because, you know, the moment I finished the goodbye and the end title, the end credits had stopped rolling, he says, "Oh, well, Andrew, nice to see you," and walked away, just pleasantly. It was all an act. He shouts and shouts and shouts. When the camera's no longer running, it was nice to see you, Andrew, thanks for that, and walked away. So nothing has come close to that, but it was wholly unproductive. It was wholly unnecessary to do. We should never have bothered.
Yeah. What about the interview with Ben Shapiro? That's attracted something like 12 million views.
Well, I think the Ben Shapiro interview speaks more to a fundamental problem of media at the moment, which is that Mr. Shapiro lives in one of these American echo chambers. And you've got them here, and you can see some of them in Britain too. Now, in which he had never met anybody who had a different view. So he's used to having people on his program that say, "And don't you agree with the following?" Yes. He said, "Yes, I agree with the following." "And don't you think that?" "Yes, I agree with that." And they all just sat and scratch each other's backs. You see that on Fox News on the right. You see that on MSNBC on the left in America as well. And we had him on. I forget what the reason was, but I did my usual thing, which was, let's find out what he stands for, and I'll take the exact opposite position, and we'll test him. You know, and I think abortion was one of the issues.
Yeah.
He is very fundamentalist, very basically no abortion. And I said, aren't you, that there's lots of people who are very wary of abortion, but the line you're taking would seem to take us back to the Dark Ages. And that's when he blew up.
Yeah.
And we had no idea that was going to happen. I was going to move on. Abortion is not one of my big subjects. I was going to move on to other subjects to talk about. And he just exploded. And I think it speaks to a country's, the danger for democracies now, and it's here, it's in my country, it's in America, is that we're all becoming atomized, and we only read the papers or watch the TV shows or listen to the radio stations that reinforce what we already think. I mean, I said on the Q&A on Monday night, I was quite surprised, given that Mr. Dutton had created the conditions now for a proper debate in Australia about The Voice, that they didn't have a major opponent of The Voice on. I mean, that's what the BBC would have done.
Yes.
We would have picked somebody that was taking the Dutton line, and we would have had someone who took the Albanese line, and the job of the anchor or the presenter was not to be to take sides, which ABC does all the time. It's to be to hold the ring and say, well, what do you say to that? And didn't you say this? And we've now got in a world where...
Put the counter argument to them.
Correct.
Yeah.
And we're now in a world in which people don't want to be challenged.
Yes.
And
that was
Shapiro
evident
had
in that
never been
interview.
challenged,
Yeah.
which is why he threw his toys
That's right.
out the pram.
He ended the interview abruptly, and you concluded by
we
saying...
had no idea what was happening. I
Yeah.
thought, what's his problem? And he said, well, I've never heard of you. I said, well, I've never heard of you, but I'm still doing the
And
interview.
in fairness to him, I think he took to Twitter afterwards acknowledging that you beat him fair and square.
He did.
That you, in his words, demolished him. Okay, next question.
Great to see you, Tom. Andrew, why the woke and what's the answer?
Why the woke? I think the woke is, as I said earlier, I think the woke comes from the university campus. That's where it started. Like all these things, it started in the American universities, particularly in the Ivy League universities. That's what makes it so insidious in a way. It starts in the top universities, and the top universities fill the top boardrooms. They fill the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, NBC, all the big companies. I think it's also come out of, in a sense, it's a post-Marxist concept as well. I think it's a reaction to the defeat of Marxism in many ways, that we lost the economic argument. Class war doesn't really work very well anymore, and the general consensus in favor of what you might broadly call a market economy is what people in the center, left, center, right work. So let's think of something different, and that is cultural identity, and ethnic identity. Let's go for that. That'll cause more problems. So the development of critical race theory in the United States, which is barely a theory. I mean, even Marcuse had more intellectual grit than critical race theory. But people love to suck it up. They love to believe it. It's commandeered. It's captured a generation, and they are taking these ideas with them into the workplace and beyond. And because it's only just begun, I think it will be a while before it can be reversed. And it's dangerous because despite the history of the United States or Britain's history of slavery or whatever, there are actually, and Australia is one of them, there are now successful multiracial societies that would have been inconceivable even 40 or 50 years ago. And, if you're black in America, it's a pretty good place to be if you want to get on in the world. But you're not allowed to say that. You are a victim and you're downtrodden and you've never escaped the legacy of slavery. And that hangs over everything. And you had this 1619 project run inevitably by the New York Times, which basically tried to completely rewrite American history. That to such an extent, the key date was 1619, that's when the first slaves arrived, and that the purpose of the American Revolution was not to throw off the British colonial power, it was to guarantee that slavery would continue. Because if Britain had stayed the imperial power, slavery would have gone. So you have then turned American history on its head Instead of being a war of independence, a war of revolution, an anti-colonial war, a war against the imperial power, to create the first republic, which is what all Americans have been taught, and is, by the way, largely true. Like all things, it's not entirely true, but it's largely true. You have now turned American independence. America's founding fundamental purpose was to preserve slavery. That's a big change. Yeah. That's not a marginal footnote rewriting of history. That upends everything Americans have thought of themselves. And yet, it's also, by the way, historical nonsense. But that's what's been done. That's a huge change that has got to work its way through. And so I don't think we're going to change this very quickly. And I think, if anything, it will get worse before it gets better.
The Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, about a century ago, talking about the left's march through the institutions.
Sure, which the young German Social Democrats tried in the 60s, and they were Marxists, but they didn't succeed.
No.
But they are succeeding. That kind of view is succeeding now.
Next question. Yes.
Hi, Andrew. Do you believe that the extremity of cultural identity politics has reached its peak? And when do you suspect that it will trough?
No, I don't believe it. I'm afraid it's going to get worse before it gets better. I find it hugely destructive. There is this general view that we don't talk about the dark side of our history, and that's what we need to do now. I mean, where I am, we talk about the dark side of our history all the time. We know that we industrialized slavery. That's what, we weren't alone. The Portuguese were at it first, then the Spanish, then the French, but we industrialized it in taking slaves from West Africa over to what became the colonies. We know the dark side of our history. We know it was one of the most evil periods in the history of mankind. But we also know that we abolished the slave trade in a wave of Christian evangelism. Wilberforce being one. And that to such an extent that even at the height of the Napoleonic War, we deployed, when Napoleon was on the brink of invading Britain, we deployed a third of the Royal Navy to West Africa to end the slave trade. So we have that great shame, which can never be wiped out, but we also have something to be proud of as well in playing a role in getting rid of the slave trade. And of course, abolishing slavery as well, which we were. And we didn't have to fight a civil war to do it, unlike the Americans. So I don't think we have ignored the bad bits of our history. And I'm comfortable talking about the bad bits of our history because I know them. And I'm sure in Australia, you can do the same thing. But just as I said earlier, we have the makings of successful multiracial societies now. And you see that here, you see it in Britain, you see it in America. We have a long way to go, but we've come a long way. You know, the king will have his coronation, I think, in just under a month's time. Now, I will show my great support of it by going to New York. The king will have his coronation, and he will do so at a time when the First Minister of Scotland is of South Asian descent, when the leader of the second biggest party in Scotland, the Labour Party, is of South Asian descent. The coronation will take place with a British Prime Minister who is Hindu, who is married to an Indian, whose Home Secretary responsible for the security of the coronation, Home Secretary is Buddhist, and the chief rabbi will stay with the king the night before the coronation so that he doesn't have to travel on the Sabbath. So, you want to tell me about diversity? I think we got diversity there. We can do more, but I think rather than concentrate on what divides us now and make mountains out of molehills, I would like to build on that and make us even more multiracial and more a diverse society and more a society at ease with itself. But there are forces afoot who dine out on emphasizing our differences and who are frankly miserable if things are working. If people are just getting along, they are miserable.
Okay, next question.
Hi, Andrew. Can I just return to Brexit for a minute?
Sure.
And just ask whether you think that there's a sense of disappointment in the Leave camp that what they were promised hasn't really been delivered yet?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there is. I've never made public my views on Brexit, so I'm not going to do so tonight. But I think there is a sense of disappointment. And I think that disappointment has come from a number of factors. One is that they put so much effort into trying to win the referendum, that having won it, which was against their expectations, they didn't think they were going to win it. Having won it, they had no idea what to do with it. And they then started knifing each other in the back. And so you ended up with Theresa May as Prime Minister, who was a Remainer. She saw Brexit as a problem to be managed as a Remainer rather than an opportunity to be exploited. So you had that most horrendous period in British politics with her as Prime Minister where nothing was happening. And it became very polarised, and a lot of Brexiteers thought the Remain forces were now organising to push it back, to make sure the referendum was not implemented. And there are many problems. And then, of course, she called the election that made it even worse. She had a working majority. She lost that. She was dependent on the DUP. No one in their right mind wants to be dependent on the Democratic, also the Unionist Party there. And only Boris broke that logjam with the landslide in 2019. But he had worked out how to win. He still didn't know what to do with it. And then, of course, and we had no proper bargaining position. And frankly, in the negotiations, the Europeans ran circles around us. And a lot of what we'd been told by the Brexiteers turned out not to be true. The German car industry will make sure you get a great deal because they have to sell their cars in Britain. We're the single biggest market for them and all that. Oh, Europe needs such as much as we need them. We'll get everything we got. Oh, turned out to be nonsense. The Europeans, and particularly the Brussels Commission, they took the view that we needed a punishment beating pour encourager les autres, to make sure no one else tried it. And it worked. No one else is trying it. Madame Meloni is a big Eurosceptic. She ain't taking Italy out. Even Le Pen has now changed her tune in France. She's very skeptical of Brussels. She doesn't even want to leave the euro anymore now on that. So it worked. And then when you thought the government might have time to do it, the pandemic came along. And that just sucked the lifeblood out of normal politics. And they just didn't have the bandwidth. I don't blame them. The pandemic was uncharted territory. They gave up on Brexit and simply dealt with the pandemic. So I think, yeah, the answer is yes, it's been disappointing. There are two signs of light that it might be getting a bit better. One was the resolution of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is a technical thing, but huge, and actually paves the way for a much better free trade deal between Britain and the European Union. That deal comes up for renewal in 2025, and I think it'll be much better. And the second thing is that because of Brexit, we have been able to join the Pacific Trade Partnership. And in the long term, that's huge. We are now part of a free trade arrangement, as is Australia, with the fastest growing part of the world. So that's not bad. So there is still hope, but they got it, and they didn't know what to do with it.
Well, look, we at CIS have been fortunate to have hosted many prominent intellectuals and business figures and journalists over the last 50 years, but I think it's really hard to beat our guest tonight. Please thank Andrew Neil.
Thank you so much. Fantastic.
For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.